Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today. We're going to have an episode today. I'm really excited to talk with my guest today because he is a great analyst on everything geopolitical. He is, among other things, a journalist, a former academic, specializing in geopolitics, you name it. He's contributed to publications like The Guardian, Salon, The Gray Zone, and now currently hanging out with Mint Press News as a senior staff writer. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
We've got Alan MacLeod.
It's great to be with you, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, and it's pronounced MacLeod for everybody that maybe is confused about that. Obviously, we're going through some intense times with the Israel-Gaza thing, and you guys have been covering that almost exclusively. And I wanted to sort of jump into sort of the sort of sleight of hand that's going on with Western media as far as covering it in ways that are disingenuous and are just false or misleading. So what has been some of the big examples of this that have been like the most egregious?
Well, I think even just the framing of the entire thing is pretty egregious. Generally, it's called the Israel-Hamas war in the West, but there's a number of problems with that. You know, to begin with, it's not really a war. A war is really between two sides of somewhat equal force, right? But what we've seen is we have seen decades of occupation, which has turned Gaza into what the United Nations called an open-air prison camp. And then on October 7th, we saw a Hamas-led incursion into Israel, which killed a number of people, although the exact figures are probably never going to be known, because we do now know that the Israeli army, the Israeli military, did kill a number of people on October 7th as well. And following that, we have seen the systematic slaughter and expulsion of nearly 2 million people out of Gaza, out of their homes, forced out of their neighborhoods, forced into refugee camps, which were then bombed. And now the Israeli government are talking about making sure that these people can never return to their homes. They're going to force them to go to places like Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, anywhere that will take them. So when we look at that, and when we look at the casualty figures, which show, you know, for every Israeli killed post-October 7th, the number of Palestinians killed is just gigantic. That doesn't really scream a war to me. In fact, the word war is really being used as a bit of a cover in order not to use words like onslaught, attack, or even stronger words like ethnic cleansing and genocide, which serious figures and big institutions and even governments are saying is completely appropriate in this instance. So that's one thing. I don't think we should really be calling this a war. Secondly, saying it's between Israel and Hamas is also quite misleading, because as we've seen through both Israeli statements from government officials and military officials, and also through their actions, this war isn't really against Hamas. This is against the Palestinian people. How is, bombing universities and blowing them up into smithereens, attacking Hamas, how is destroying almost every hospital in Gaza about, destroying Hamas? It's not. It's about making Gaza unlivable so that the people of Gaza will not return. And furthermore, how is this really being prosecuted in the West Bank, which is not controlled by Hamas, or in Lebanon, which is not controlled by Hamas, or anywhere else that Israel is attacking, like Syria or wherever else? So this is really clearly a much wider conflict than just between Israel and Hamas, which is a relatively small militia-style group which has a political wing and a military wing that does guerrilla hit-and-run tactics against the Israeli military and other targets. So again, that whole framing of this as just being a war between Israel and Hamas seems completely off. And we should really be talking about this as, an onslaught or an ethnic cleansing campaign. Some of the most egregious media coverage of this has been to take Israeli claims at face value while not even reporting on the other side. So we recently learned that CNN, from their CEO down, this comes completely top down, as the CNN CEO actually sent out a memo telling all staff not to quote Hamas officials because Hamas, whatever they say, is simply, quote, not newsworthy, end quote. And Hamas gives us nothing but propaganda and lies. And yet CNN takes as gospel whatever the IDF tells them. Like, for example, that on October 7th, Hamas committed a massacre where they beheaded 40 babies. Now, that was reported all over the world, especially by CNN. They described this as a confirmed case that was basically, cut and dried, completely stamped. And then they started talking about it as like, well, how can we ever negotiate with people who will do this? There is one problem, though. On October 7th, 40 children weren't even killed, let alone beheaded, and there's no evidence of these beheadings. However, there is plentiful evidence of hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian children being beheaded and having their limbs ripped off through US-made Israeli bombs which are dropped on civilian targets. I have lost count of how many people or how many videos I've seen of children being maimed, killed, and their parents or their neighbors crying over their bodies, carrying them around. I've seen press conferences done by Palestinian doctors who are literally standing on the corpses of dozens of people who they tried to save in their hospitals but couldn't, partially because they were being bombed and partially because the US-backed Israeli forces are not allowing humanitarian supplies in. When we talk about hospital bombings, the United States and its media has been highly duplicitous on this. I'm thinking specifically about the Al-Ali Baptist Hospital in Gaza, which was bombed. Clearly must have been from the Israeli side, but for weeks this narrative arose in Western media talking about how this was probably the fault of Palestinian Islamic Jihad and one of their errant rockets. However, when you actually look at the sort of rockets that this group has, they have launched thousands into Israel, and they've been responsible for a handful of casualties. And yet we're supposed to believe that one of these rockets killed 500 people in a hospital after it misfired. It just doesn't make any sense. And so we've seen throughout these past few months, the media have really carried weight for the Israeli war machine and for the US national security state and military industrial complex more generally, because of course, this onslaught couldn't actually happen without Western support. The United States has been sending billions of dollars worth of medical aid and billions of dollars worth of military aid as well to Israel. The United Kingdom has been flying spy missions over Gaza, helping the Israeli military, restocking them with flights from their base in Cyprus, dozens of them. And of course, Western countries have been giving Israel political support, not only through statements, but also blocking actions in international bodies like the United Nations. Western countries have been cutting support to UNRWA, which is the United Nations body that deals with Palestinian refugees, specifically because UNRWA was really being a thorn in the side of Israel and its war machine, reporting things that perhaps Israel and the United States didn't want reported or didn't want heard. And so really, when we talk about this, I don't want to talk about it as like the Israel-Hamas war. I want to talk about it as a Western-backed Israeli onslaught on Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands of people and ruined the lives of millions more. And that is how I think most people around the world actually understand this. And we can see this in opinion polls, which show that not only has Israel fallen in world opinion, the United States is falling as well, because the people of the world see how closely Western countries, particularly the US, are supporting Israel, and they are disgusted by it. And, maybe this will be a turning point. We might look back on this and say that this was really the turning point where the US really starts to lose its grip over the world. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I hope so, because the hegemony needs to go away, and America needs to get the memo that the imperialist sort of times are over. 20th century is gone. And when Israel stubs its toe on its desk, it immediately attributes it to Hamas. Now, when Belgium, can you talk about this recent thing with Belgium?
What specifically one are you speaking about?
Well, Belgium recently said that they weren't going to cut funding to the UNRWA.
It's been... Yeah, sorry. It's been interesting to see that, because UNRWA has, the thing about the United Nations is that Western countries really dominate it, in the sense that they wrote the rules back in the 1940s when the United Nations was really being set up. But they're also blocking so much of the positive change and the potential force that the United Nations could have as being a democratizing force in not only the Middle East, but around the world. When you look at countries that actually, use their veto power or even have veto power or vote against the majority in the UN, it's very often a case, if you look at the map, it's like West versus the rest. It's Western Europe, North America, Japan, and maybe a couple other countries that are voting one way and the rest of the world another. And we're seeing that with UNRWA, right? So, countries like the United States and many other Western European countries immediately rushed to pull out funding from UNRWA after some rather dodgy reporting suggesting that they were all sorts of UNRWA employees who were actually moonlighting for Hamas. But we have to remember that UNRWA is one of the biggest employers in Gaza. I believe it employs tens of thousands of people there. Hamas was the elected government in Gaza. It's a very large political body. It handles all sorts of social issues there, as well as being a military wing. So it's completely unsurprising that some people working for UNRWA might have had some ties to Hamas. In fact, it would have been astonishing if that wasn't the case. And yet even then, these accusations are starting to fall apart here. And fortunately, some Western European nations didn't go along with the memo that they got from the United States to say cut funding. Belgium was one of them. Spain actually is an interesting case. Spain has decided to increase funding to UNRWA right now, which is pretty interesting given what its peers are doing. So perhaps we're seeing a little bit of a crack in the sort of united front that we're used to seeing in Western Europe, where there's just so much violence and so much bloodshed that certain governments are thinking that we can't really be seen to stand and support this. In the United States, of course, President Biden, his approval ratings are tanking, especially among young people and especially among Muslim Americans, which are two groups he probably really needs to have come out in support for him if he wants to win the election in 2024. Muslim Americans make up a large percentage of the overall population of Michigan, one of the key battleground states, which Trump won in 2016 and Biden took back from him in 2020. If Trump wins Michigan in 2024, it's going to be difficult to see how Biden can retain the presidency. So this question about what's happening in Palestine right now is really having reverberations throughout the world, whether it's in Western Europe or the United States.
Yeah. And going back to the sort of propaganda machine that's going in overdrive right now on behalf of Western powers, can you talk a bit about other players, like, for instance, this Visegrad 24, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but what's their whole role? Because obviously they're just going for the whole line without equivocation.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a really mediated age. And what I mean by that is that these wars are playing out not only on the battlefield in the Middle East, in Western Asia, perhaps we should call it more accurately, but they're also happening across our screens and our laptops and generally in cyberspace. And one of the most interesting things that's happened is that as everybody's attention is actually focused upon Israel and Palestine, there have been so many groups popping up trying to exploit this attention and trying to push narratives in certain directions. Everybody's got a bias, so I'm not saying that I want some unbiased news about Israel-Palestine. I don't really think that's possible. But one group that's really come to the fore is Visegrad 24, which was only started a few years ago as a social media platform. They don't even have a website, but they talk about themselves as a news aggregator. And they have become phenomenally influential in manipulating and influencing the debate online. Visegrad 24 presents itself as a sort of neutral arbiter of news about the Middle East. However, what I found when I studied them was actually that they are quietly funded by the far-right government of Poland, who are very supportive of Israel. And when you actually look at what Visegrad's content comes out, you see that immediately throughout their thing. It's just wall-to-wall propaganda, demonizing Muslims, demonizing Palestinians, and lionizing the apartheid state of Israel. And they're not exactly, it would be one thing if they just took a pro-Israel bent on the news. But unfortunately, what makes them so problematic is that they just constantly put out so much demonstrably and ludicrously fake news that it really should undermine their entire platform. Somehow it doesn't, though. So, for example, they published a long video which they presented as a Palestinian man condemning Hamas and saying, it's all Hamas's fault. However, this man is actually an Israeli comedian, which anyone in Israel should probably know, and yet this was presented as, this this Palestinian man going against Hamas, and of course this represents what the Palestinian people really think, etc., etc. They're on Israel's side. They've also been caught just ludicrously appropriating videos taken by Palestinian journalists showing Israeli crimes and then saying this was actually Hamas doing this. And they've been called out constantly, time and time again. And yet it doesn't seem to hurt their views or their ratings or their algorithm score, because they go from strength to strength. In fact, there was one study of the most important and most influential accounts on X, formerly Twitter, with regard to Israel-Palestine. And Visegrad 24 came out as the #1 most important and influential account there, which is really surprising given the fact that it seems to be run by a bunch of faceless people from Eastern Europe, and that they're funded by a government source, and that they constantly push out just completely and utterly false information. But unfortunately, that's the world we're living in. That they always say that in war, truth is the first casualty, and it's no different on social media as well.
I think we're living through this time where it's weaponized more than ever. I mean, you have this new pervasive way to communicate with people. And of course, there used to be rules against journalists saying false things on, mainstream things. But now the door is open where people like me can just get on with a microphone and spread whatever I want. So it's a double-edged sword in that way. But are we seeing the tide turn? Obviously, this is the historical context of this goes way back before October 7th, and you guys have been at Mint Press at least talking about it for a long time. Do you think the tide is turning as far as people understanding the true nature of this conflict?
Well, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell these things in the moment, but we are seeing significantly more people across the world taking up the Palestinian position, particularly young people, people really getting interested in what's going on, people not really believing what they're hearing on corporate media or in the newspapers or wherever. Definitely there has been this long, slow shift towards less support for Israel and more sensitivity and solidarity with Palestine in the Western world, particularly in the United States. And we see that in new polls that came out. Net favorability, for instance, I'm talking about this Time poll, which came out last month. Net favorability of Israel across the world dropped by an average of 18.5 points between September and December, which is just enormous considering it was only a few months. We've seen Israel, for example, their net favorability in Japan went from -39 to -62. And even countries like the United Kingdom, Israel's net favorability is now -30. So it's got a 30-point deficit there, which is just extraordinary. The US, a little bit less so. Israel is still very popular there. But ultimately, across the world, when we talk about the entire population, most of the world sees this conflict or this occupation for what it is. If you go across Africa, Latin America, Asia, most of these countries really have a much more clear-eyed view of the conflict than people in the West do. And I think that's probably because they're not just bombarded with propaganda all the time. One interesting aspect of the whole battle for ideas that's going on is that when you really break down who in the West is supporting Israel and who is supporting the Palestinian position more, you see younger people are far, far more likely to be sensitive and awake to the suffering of the Palestinian people, while older people are very much stuck in the dyed-in-the-wool Israel supporters. And I think that's really down to what sort of media that you consume. Older people, in general, very much use cable news, very much still in the old media of newspapers, print, radio, etc. And these are still dominated by these old institutions which have been around for decades, if not centuries. And they're basically pushing the same line as you have seen for decades on Israel-Palestine, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that it's defending itself from Palestinian terrorism, and we have to support Israel. But the situation is very different on social media. People who get their news from TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, or even people who are not very political at all, it's very hard not to have seen so many just devastating, disgusting, upsetting videos of the barbarity of what's going on during this genocide, which has been going on for months now. So if you're exposed to that on a daily basis, it's very hard not to see that and feel sympathy and feel outrage, because, after all, we're empathetic human beings. And so if you're being exposed to that, which you will be more likely, at least if you're using social media, then you're naturally going to move and gravitate towards a sort of more anti-occupation stance. The powers that be, the elites, are very worried about this. They do not want young people starting to revolt over what their governments are helping fund. And so we are now seeing so many more people in think tanks and big political parties talking about the need to regulate the internet. We've heard so much about how TikTok is apparently full of anti-Semitic memes or, pro-China, anti-Israel content. This is all a sort of an excuse to try and retighten control over the means of communication, because ultimately, even though there are so many flaws with social media in terms of who can actually get their message out, what sort of accounts get promoted and what sort of accounts get defunded and pushed to the side or deranked or whatever, there is still some semblance of democracy in terms of what gets seen. And that's very dangerous to the powers that be, who really need to keep a tight lid on what's going on in Israel-Palestine, because ultimately I'm convinced that if everybody did see the truth of what was going on, virtually nobody would support this. And hopefully, with social media continuing to become the dominant form of communication worldwide, hopefully that trend can continue, and we will see this as a sort of tipping point, the tipping point where Israel could no longer act with complete impunity and with no consequence. And it was the tipping point towards the time when the world decided that actually the West might not have their best interests at heart and maybe they should go their own way.
Yeah. Do you think that there is some chance that social media itself, obviously we've seen a higher ratio of Palestinian, things that are happening to Palestinians more than we saw anything about what Israel is claiming, they're killing so many people. In reality, we see that Palestinians are truly the oppressed ones. Do you think that'll put the nail in the coffin of sort of imperialist, sort of, this realpolitik American style of doing things, kill everybody, ask questions later? Do you think that we could move towards a more diplomatic world with the help of, these videos that we see the truth with our own eyes?
Well, I guess that depends on whether those videos or that information really spurs Western publics, particularly the American public, into political action. If it just inspires disgust and apathy and people don't really get involved in politics or, just kind of drop out, then I don't think it's actually going to have that effect. However, if we do see these issues really energizing people and convincing them to get involved in politics, pushing pressure on elected representatives, putting pressure on businesses who conduct trade with the state of Israel, then actually that could have a very positive effect, and it might be a stepping stone towards a better future. Maybe what we're seeing right now is the United States is starting to lose control economically of the world. Back in 1945, the United States had literally half the world's wealth. The other industrial powers like the Soviet Union or Germany or United Kingdom or France were completely destroyed. China had been destroyed over 200 years of, or at least 100 years of colonialism, India 200 years. And so the United States was in this completely dominant economic position, meaning that it could really do what it wanted politically, economically, militarily. However, as that situation has started to change a little bit, particularly with the rise of Asian countries like China and to a lesser extent India, we're seeing the United States is no longer really the unquestionable number one power economically. China, if you look at maps, now is the largest trading partner of a plurality of countries around the world. The United States no longer has that position where it's this dominant manufacturing power. In fact, when you look at what the United States actually exports, a lot of it is just nonsense that really we don't need. It's like financial stuff, or it's stuff like
derivatives, yeah,
or, Netflix, yeah, like Wall Street stuff, or rentier economies like Microsoft Word or something. The stuff that actually could get replaced very easily. Whereas China is actually making, or not just China, but Asian countries are actually making tangible products that we need and want and that are important for society. And so as we move forward into the 21st century, we might see the United States being constrained a little bit in that respect. However, one aspect where the United States is still unquestionably number one is with its military. It has the strongest military in the world. It spends almost as much as the rest of the world combined on arms, on weapons. It can still project power in that sense. And the really worrying thing that I think will really come to dominate the 21st century is how the United States manages that economic decline while still being a military superpower. The worry is that while economically it might be declining, it might try to keep control over as much of the world as possible through its military, meaning that there might actually be a chance that there'll be more military endeavors, more invasions, more conquests, more wars of exploitation than we saw in the late 20th. That's certainly not something I want to see, but it's most definitely something that could happen if things fall into place in the right way.
I think you brought up a good point, Alan. Now you just scared the hell out of me. Can you talk a little bit about the role of South Korea and Japan at the moment, and also in terms of the failing hegemony of the United States? I mean, the United States is going down in flames. How many of its Asian partners is it going to drag down with it?
Very interesting question. South Korea and Japan emerged after World War II out of the complete wreckage of their societies as some of the poorest places in the world, and within one generation had made it to the point where these places had actually entered the first world in terms of being advanced economies. However, they still are very much under the control of the United States politically. Japan has more or less been a one-party state in terms of who's actually controlling the country since the 1950s. The LDP, as it's called, the Liberal Democratic Party, was started with the help of the CIA, which funded it for many, many years to get it up on its feet. And it's still very much the dominant force in Japanese politics. Likewise, with Korea, we've seen huge presence of the United States in that country, controlling the sort of political outlook of the place. The US has tens of thousands of troops. Last time I checked was 50,000 in South Korea. They, of course, invaded the Korean Peninsula in the Korean War, and they haven't left. Likewise, in Japan, the United States invaded in World War II. They have not left. The United States has over 100 military bases in Japan and many dozens more in Korea. And what these have really been used for in the last 10 years or so is they are the center point, the focal point of the Obama administration and then later Trump and Biden's pivot to Asia, whereby in the early 2010s, US war planners realized that the Middle East was not so much the most strategic place in the world anymore, and they were very worried about the economic rise of China. And so what they started to do was move their forces towards East Asia. We've seen a ring of 300 to 400 military bases, depending on who you ask, encircling China from everywhere from, as we were saying, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Guam, Australia, over into Western Asia with places like Afghanistan as well. And the whole point is trying to delay China's rise or at best suffocate it so it doesn't rise. But that's not really happening as the United States has hoped. China has gone from being a manufacturer of very cheap, low-tech products in the late 20th century, where we used to get our textiles and our toys from, to the point where it's actually one of the manufacturing superpowers in terms of high-tech industry, making semiconductors. It's the world leader in green transport like electric vehicles or high-speed rail. Solar panel production in China is beyond anything that Europe or the United States has been able to produce. And so China's really looking at being this economic powerhouse. And not only that, the countries around China have actually managed to grow and prosper because of that. Countries in Southeast Asia have seen their trade with China absolutely boom, and that's helped their economies. I'm thinking specifically of places like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all the countries in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This would certainly benefit South Korea and Japan if they could come to some sort of peaceful, neutral economics agreements with China. Japan and South Korea both have very highly educated populations. There are tens of millions of workers in both countries who could be doing very important jobs and stuff that could really make their countries prosper. But because the United States still has that overwhelming economic and political control over these two countries and keeps them on a relatively tight leash, this just hasn't happened. And so Japan, which was the second largest economy in the world in the 1980s, was a place where people were prospering, hasn't really seen any sort of serious GDP growth or economic growth in 30 years. The United States came in the late 80s and really kneecapped the economy, forcing Japan to sign all sorts of onerous trade deals with the US, which really took the legs out underneath its own semiconductor industry production, and also just the production of its high-tech sector in general. So we're seeing a lot of Japanese companies that we associate with, like, the electronics industry, really struggling right now. And, it's not really entirely clear whether all of them will survive. So I would say it really, East Asia does have a choice here. And the clear economic choice would be to grow closer to China economically while maintaining a sort of neutral stance. But the United States, as I mentioned, really does not want that to happen. The United States does not want to see its position as top dog being undermined and it just becoming an important regional player in the world. They don't really want that. They want to remain the unquestioned number one. And so they are, as your question suggested, trying to drag South Korea, Japan, Australia, countries like that along with them, for better or worse. And, what you said, not just dragging them along, but they might eventually be dragging them down if the 21st century becomes the Asian century, which so many people are suggesting.
Japan used to be the world semiconductor manufacturers. They used to produce a lot of the electronics and stuff, and that has since moved to Taiwan when you have TSMC being the number one creator of these very small semiconductors. And they tried to open a place in Arizona, but they realized that we didn't have the skilled labor in order to do that. And it's because the United States' education has just gone down the tubes, of course, for-profit capitalist sort of stuff. So let me ask you this. Obviously, Joe Biden is having a hard time cobbling together sentences, and that makes it so, somebody like Trump is pretty much looks to, from my perspective, he's going to go in there. What other geopolitical implications is that going to have if Trump comes back into office?
Well, that's the $64 billion question, I guess. If the Democrats aren't able to sort of patch together a win against Donald Trump in 2024, we will see differences in foreign policy. Trump, although he didn't actually start any wars, he was by no means some sort of anti-war candidate. Trump, of course, famously sold the Saudis tens of billions of dollars worth of lethal military aid so they could carry out a genocide against Yemen. Trump blocked any sort of action by the United Nations to to at least mitigate the suffering of the Yemeni people. He dropped the mother of all bombs, which was the largest non-nuclear bomb ever used, on Afghanistan. He threatened North Korea with a nuclear attack. He wanted to organize a coup in Venezuela. In fact, he did organize a coup in Venezuela, and he suggested invading the country, and he had to be talked back off of that ledge from his generals, no doubt. So Trump is absolutely by no means any sort of anti-war, pro-peace candidate. And why I'm saying that is that when you look historically, whether it's somebody with a red tie or a blue tie in the White House, very often the sorts of foreign policy decisions tend not to be that different whoever comes in. Because, of course, while we might have different faces in the Oval Office and in certain think tanks, the actual structure of the DC bubble doesn't change too much. The people who are in control of the military or the security services like the CIA, they don't really change very much, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. And so while there might be different decisions that Trump might make in comparison to Biden, in general, the ship will be steered in the same direction. Now, I don't know what would have happened if Donald Trump was in power right now compared to Biden, but I do remember people saying, we have to elect Biden because if we don't, Trump is a madman who'll start a war in the Middle East and we'll be bombing all of these countries. And actually, a lot of the worst case scenarios, well, I better not say the worst case scenarios because there are much worse, but a lot of some of the worst things we were thinking that Trump might do in his second term, Biden is actually kind of doing himself. And so it's difficult to say what's actually going to be different about a Trump versus a Biden candidacy. What we could say is Trump's a lot more of a sort of a loose cannon in terms of diplomacy, and very often those sorts of things can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings, diplomatic incidents. Certainly Trump, it seems, was much more hawkish on Iran. That's because a lot of the Republican Party's donors, like Sheldon Adelson, were very much on that sort of pro-Israel, anti-Iran tip. They've been pushing for increased hostilities with Iran for a very long time, whereas the Democrats perhaps not so much involved in that. They were more interested in signing the Iran nuclear deal. So we could see an increased hostility with Iran if Trump is elected. But apart from that, it's difficult really to see so far into the future to guess what sorts of different kind of foreign policies will be coming out of the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. Because, of course, we condemn or we look at people who are in power and say, this administration did that and the other administration didn't do that. But of course, we never really know what the alternative reality is, whether there was some guy in blue in the White House rather than some guy in red at the time. And so we'll never really know how different these two parties would be given the sort of circumstances they're facing.
I would say it's this different flavors of the same sort of fascist military-industrial complex thing. But in the case of Russia, however, it seems like relations are quite warmer with Trump. I don't know what the real relation is. And you have also Tucker Carlson going over there to conduct this interview with Putin. Now, can you speak a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of Republicans for quite a long time have actually quite admired Vladimir Putin and his administration, because Putin's administration is very socially conservative, quite economically conservative. He's presented as a strong man, a tough guy who doesn't take any nonsense from people. And of course, Russia's a very white country. This is the sort of leader that a lot of people in the Republican Party actually quietly think, yeah, this guy could or should be one of us. I mean, there's a lot of parallels between United Russia and the Republican Party. So there's that to begin with. Secondly, we have to remember why this hostility with Russia really came up in the first place. If we go back even 12 years ago, Russia was not considered a geopolitical enemy. In fact, there's a famous clip from the debates between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, the presidential debates, I think of 2012, where Obama is actually openly laughing at Mitt Romney when he said Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe. He said the 1980s called, and this is a direct quote, he said the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. And everyone was laughing at Romney, talking about how ridiculous it was that he was living in the era of the Cold War. Russia is not, a big threat. But what happened, of course, in 2016 was, as soon as Hillary Clinton lost the election, she really looked around for reasons why she didn't beat the least popular, or rather the most unpopular candidate to ever really run for the US presidential nomination. And she didn't look at her own failings. She didn't look at why she didn't campaign in key battleground states. She didn't think about how she didn't put any progressive legislation on offer, why she ran literally the most vacuous, policy-free presidential campaign in modern history, according to political scientists. Her message was basically, usually it was, #1, wouldn't it be great for a woman to be president? And #2, I'm not Trump. And I'm not saying, actually, I think I'm not Trump was probably her strongest selling point, to be honest. So I would have probably pushed that line as well. Have you seen the other guy is a pretty good slogan for Clinton. But ultimately, it wasn't enough to get her across the line. And so she looked around for excuses, really. And they decided very early on that foreign interference in social media and in our election, particularly from Russia, was going to be the reason why she lost against Donald Trump. And so for years, we had the more democratic aligned media like MSNBC constantly putting out stories about how Russia hacked our election and stole democracy away from us, whereas the Republican Party, well, they didn't like that narrative at all, so they never really went in for this Russia bashing. And so that's basically the situation we're in right now, where the focus on Russia is much more of a democratic drive, whereas the focus on China is actually probably pushed a little bit more by the Republican Party and the conservative movement more generally. And one of those people is actually someone you just mentioned, Tucker Carlson, who has constantly poured cold water on this whole idea that Russia swung the election, that Vladimir Putin is the be-all and end-all when it comes to pure evil. He's certainly had a more some might say nuanced, some might say pro-Russia stance on the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he's just gone to Moscow, apparently. What people are saying is to interview Vladimir Putin. And I don't really see anything specifically wrong with interviewing foreign leaders. We have to live in the real world, and it doesn't matter whether you love or hate Putin. And I think most people in the West basically hate Putin. He's still the leader, the unquestioned leader of one of the more powerful countries in the world, the largest nation in the world by area. So it makes sense that we should know what he's thinking. And it doesn't mean that you have to throw softballs at Putin like so many of the interviews we watch on cable news with politicians are like nowadays. You can throw him hardball questions and really grill him. I don't know if Tucker's going to do that, but yeah, that's the situation we're in right now, where it seems that even talking to Russians seems to be something which is completely unacceptable in much of corporate media, even though we talk to all sorts of unsavory characters all the time. And I think we have to just, accept that this world is full of people that, we perhaps rather not be in power, but that's just how it is. And so given that is the situation, I think that's completely acceptable. Tucker, I'll just say as a final thing, though, as I alluded to earlier, has really been on this very anti-China bandwagon. I remember watching an interview with somebody he had on who said that, the military has gone woke, and what we really need is type A sorts of individuals who want to sit on a throne of Chinese skulls. That's the sort of language that's coming out of a lot of Tucker's positions, where his position seems to be, I'm not for this war against Russia because we really have to be focusing more of our efforts on China. And that is not an anti-war position, frankly. That is just saying that the US empire should be looking in one direction and not another. But a lot of people, I think, are perhaps confusing that with a sort of anti-war position, because unfortunately, genuine, principled people who oppose conflicts and aggression are few and far between on our corporate media anyway.
Yeah, and it seems like because of the military-industrial complex, for since the beginning of time, the United States has always needed sort of a boogeyman, whether neoconservatives cooked one up with the Cold War or whatever. Do you think that the United States absolutely has to have this boogeyman where you got the neoliberals picking Russia and the neoconservatives picking China? Is it just part of the way that things work?
Oh yeah, listen, this has been a justification used in the United States for more than a century, actually. There's always has to be some foreign force interfering so that we can come in and jump in and defend ourselves. If you go back over 100 years when the United States invaded Haiti in 1915, I believe it was, the justification back then was that, all of this trouble and uprisings and unrest in Haiti, this has the Huns' hands all over it. That's what big media outlets were saying back then. The Huns being the German Empire under the Kaiser, who were currently involved in World War One, and generally Germany was seen as the boogeyman in the United States in that conflict. And of course, a couple of years later, the United States did actually declare war on Germany, and hundreds of thousands of American troops went over to Europe to fight Germans. Then when you go into World War II, suddenly it's the Germans that are doing everything. Then we go into the Cold War, and suddenly every time the United States wants to invade countries like Nicaragua in the 1980s, or Grenada is another example, this tiny island in the Caribbean, suddenly we always see the Soviets' hands all over these new governments. Suddenly they're secretly communist controlled, and there's a worldwide communist conspiracy that the Russians are planning to take over every country in the world, and that's why we have to build up our military forces and stay vigilant and overthrow whichever government we like, whether it's in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, to stop this worldwide threat of communism. And of course, when that goes away in the 1990s, suddenly people are looking around for more excuses. A couple that worked for a couple of years was this threat of narco trafficking or drug gangs. We saw that used in the 1990s, particularly in Latin America. And of course, once 9/11 happened, this boogeyman of terrorism became the main reason why the United States continued to have to spend as much as pretty much every other country combined on its military. This gigantic behemoth, which really is around the neck of the American people, this gigantic military suffocating the United States, always has to have a justification. And Osama bin Laden, ISIS, Al-Qaeda really did that for 20 years or more. Now that's rather wearing thin. The Biden administration has pulled out of Afghanistan. ISIS is barely even an existing organization anymore. And so now we're really seeing China and Russia as being ramped up as these boogeymen that we have to continue to fight. And that's the reason we have to continue to increase this bloated military budget. Ultimately, if there was no justification for spending $1 trillion a year on the military, people would start asking questions. Of course they would. In fact, even with this boogeyman, people are asking questions. And so there's always has to be some kind of justification. But you can't sell a justification to the American people saying, well, we spend all of this on our military so we can terrorize the world into agreeing to terrible trade deals and allowing American companies into their countries to exploit their natural resources and sell stuff to the people that they don't want. That's really not going to cut it with ordinary people. So you have to invent some kind of mortal enemy that Americans have to be scared of all of the time. And for the last 50 to 100 years, that's actually worked very well as a cover for US imperial operations around the world, and it continues to this day.
Yeah, if we don't go over there and kill everybody, then they'll surely come over here and kill us. So in the case of China and Russia, we're seeing very little, very benign imperialistic, endeavors. They don't really do what we do as far as going to other places, overthrowing their governments, and then extracting the resources out of that country. So before we go, I just wanted to ask you, you did write a piece recently, the United States nuclear Iran, the shadowy intelligence linked group dividing the U.S. towards war with Iran. Can you talk about this? This is very exciting.
Sure, I can. Yeah, that was published over at Mint Press News, where I work. So check out mintpressnews.com. Yeah, I mean, I guess even as the world is dedicating its attention towards Israel and Palestine, there are many in Washington that actually want to divert people's attention, specifically the US government's attention, towards Tehran. And one of them is United Against Nuclear Iran, who are this rather shadowy, very powerful neoconservative organization. They are staffed by some of the classic neocons of the Bush administration, like John Bolton, who was George Bush's ambassador to the United Nations at the times of the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions. There's people on there who used to be the head of the CIA. There are people there who had high-level ambassadorships in the United States. There's people like Joel Lieberman, who was a former Democratic vice presidential nominee. There's people who used to be the director of the Mossad, which is the Israeli intelligence agency. And together, this group, United Against Nuclear Iran, constantly put out reports suggesting that pretty much every force, every nefarious force in the Middle East, whether it's Hamas or Ansar Allah in Yemen, aka the Houthis, or Hezbollah, or the Iraqi militias, are all secretly or not so secretly controlled by Iran, who are really the puppet master orchestrating so many terrorist attacks against the United States. And their solution is pretty clear about what they want. They want regime change in Tehran, whether that means war or whether that means some sort of covert operation. Sometimes they flip between the two. But this group, yeah, they have the ears of a lot of very powerful people in Washington. This is not a fringe group by any means. I mean, they are funded very handsomely by some of the top Republican donors like Sheldon Adelson, the Israeli-American casino magnate, and they're able to attract people to their conferences to speak at them, people like Mike Pompeo, who was former Secretary of State and former head of the CIA under Donald Trump. So this group really is secretly, quietly, and not so quietly trying to push the United States towards a war with Iran and towards more conflict there. Why are they doing that? I think they're ideologically committed to the idea. I think many of them are very close to the Israeli government as well. And some of them, like John Bolton, have basically made it their career goal to start a US war with Iran because they see the Iraq war as unfinished business and Iran as the real target. And the more that we know about this group and the more that we study them, the better, because they are some of the most dangerous individuals in the United States, because a war with Iran would make the Iraq war look like a cakewalk, frankly. Iran is a country of 90 million people or so. Their army is much stronger than the Iraqi army. They have, not just larger, but they have much better weapons. They are much better organized, and they have spent decades now playing out scenarios about a US attack on their country and how they would respond. And so ultimately, yeah, these people are really risking World War III in order to get this pipe dream of a different government elected or put into place in Iran. And we should know about it because this could not only cost Americans huge amounts in taxes, it might cost tens of thousands of servicemen's lives. So we really ought to know a lot more about United Against Nuclear Iran.
Yeah. Interesting developments on the way, folks. Stay tuned. We'll see if we can manage not to blow up the entire world. Alan MacLeod, wonderful human being. Mint Press News, if you're a leftist, if you're a libertarian, doesn't matter what you are, go over there, check out Mint Press News, because they are doing the work that the mainstream media outlets aren't doing and refuse to do. Anything you want to add before we go, sir?
No, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. So yeah, everybody just check out Mint Press News or check me out on social media as well.
And of course on Twitter too. He's got an incredible Twitter feed that is surely to open your eyes about some topics. So Alan MacLeod, wonderful guy. He'll be back again, I'm sure. We'll stick around. We'll talk right after this.